Hi guys, tonight we're stepping inside one of the most feared machines of World War II, the German Tiger I tank, and seeing the brutal Eastern Front through the eyes of those who lived, fought, and tried to survive inside it. This is not a tale of glory or victory, but of oil-stained hands, sleepless nights, frost-bitten mornings, and the quiet terror that never quite left your chest. You'll hear what it was really like to be crammed in steel with 4 other men, to hear the thud of enemy shells echo through the armor, and to wonder, with each shot fired, whether it might be your last. But before we begin, if you're someone who loves slow, curious dives into forgotten worlds, tap the like button, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to get to know my viewers better. So let's begin. Calmly, slowly, and close to the steel floor of the tank, where the war was cold, loud, and far too real. The first thing you noticed inside the Tiger wasn't the weapons, or even the thick armor. It was the smell, a constant mix of burnt oil, rubber, gunpowder, and sweat that clung to everything, seeped into your uniform, and made your skin feel older than it was. And although you'd get used to it, in a way, that scent would always stay with you, a reminder that you were no longer part of the clean world outside. Climbing in wasn't simple either. The hatches were tight, awkward, and if you weren't careful, you'd hit your head or shoulder hard on the steel frame, something most of us did at least once a day without complaint, because inside the Tiger, there was no room for complaints, only orders, routine, and discipline. The walls were so close that you could touch both sides of the compartment with your elbows out. And when all 5 of us were inside, commander, gunner, loader, driver, and radio operator, it felt like living inside a mechanical lung that never fully exhaled, always rumbling, always trembling with the pulse of its Maybach engine. My position was the gunner, and that meant my world was the main cannon and the sights, and while that sounds powerful from the outside, it mostly meant sitting still, watching through a narrow scope, waiting, adjusting, sometimes for hours, sometimes for seconds, knowing that if I missed, the crew could die, and if I hit, I'd see the aftermath only through a narrow slit of vision, never fully human, never fully unreal. Our commander, Feldman, was sharp-eyed and quiet, a man who barely spoke but always knew where to look. He'd tap the side of the turret, 2 short knocks, then 1 long, and I'd shift left, aim higher, adjust focus, and when he muttered, "Feuer," my finger moved instinctively, trained by endless drills, until I no longer thought about what I was aiming at, only about distance, wind velocity, armor thickness. The loader, Heinrich, was barely 20, and his arms were always in motion, even in sleep it seemed, always checking shells, always wiping down the breach, always sweating, because the moment you stopped moving inside the Tiger, your body remembered the cold, or the heat, depending on the season, and the ache set in, low and steady, like rust in the joints. Our driver, Klaus, was calm, even when shells were falling near us, his hands tight on the controls, never jerky, never rushed, even when we were backing up blind through mud or snow, or shattered buildings. And I remember once, after a narrow escape from a T-34 ambush, he simply lit a cigarette and said, "Still runs," like the Tiger was a truck and we were just delivering bread. The 5th man, Otto, sat at the radio, his headphones always on, his expression unreadable, sometimes smiling for no reason at all, and though he didn't talk much, we knew he was listening to more than just orders. He heard the fear, the confusion, the screams sometimes, and somehow he carried that alone. Our days were measured not in hours, but in intervals between engagements, in the rattle of tracks, the hiss of hydraulics, the taste of iron in your mouth after a close hit. And when the sun rose or fell, it didn't matter much, because inside the tank, time didn't pass. It crouched with us, watching, heavy and unmoving. Sometimes, we sat for days in a tree line, or behind a ridge, engines off, hands frozen around mugs of weak coffee, while Feldman stared through binoculars, and I imagined what the village ahead must smell like, what its church bells would sound like if there was no war. And how strange it was that I could be thinking about bells while sitting beside a 56-ton weapon designed to destroy. It was in these quiet hours that the war felt most real, not in the firefights or the explosions, but in the waiting, the stillness, the breath that you held without realizing, the way even the birds didn't sing in certain places, as if the air itself remembered what had happened there. One evening, as we prepared to move forward through a frozen orchard, I looked up through the hatch and saw the sky, pale and streaked with winter clouds, and for a moment I felt so far from everything I had known before, family, childhood, even my own name, that I wondered if I'd ever return to that world, or if this steel coffin was now the only home I would ever know. That thought stayed with me longer than I expected, and though I never said it aloud, I saw the same quiet question in the eyes of the others. How much of ourselves had we already left behind on this endless road of snow, fire, and steel? The first time we saw a T-34 up close, it didn't come from across a wide field or out of a distant tree line the way we had imagined during training, but instead appeared almost silently from behind the remains of a burned-out barn, its gun already halfway turned toward us, its turret moving like the slow glance of some giant animal, and in that moment, as our commander barked orders and Heinrich slammed the next shell into the breach with shaking hands, I felt something I had not yet felt in this war. Not fear exactly, but a sudden sharp awareness that this wasn't a drill. The Tiger's main gun was slow but devastating, and I watched through the scope as my sight locked onto the sloped armor of the enemy tank, its shape distorted slightly by heat and smoke, and then, with Feldman's sharp fire, I pulled the trigger and felt the entire vehicle lurch backward from the recoil, the shock running through my arms and chest as the shell tore through the morning air, and struck its target with a dull, sickening crunch that I would come to recognize over time as the sound of steel losing an argument. The T-34 didn't explode dramatically the way it might have in films. Instead it seemed to shudder, twist, and then lean as if exhausted, black smoke beginning to pour from beneath its turret like breath in the cold, and I remember wondering absurdly if anyone inside had time to realize what had happened before the fire took them. We didn't cheer, didn't speak, just sat in the sudden silence that followed, listening to the engine hum and the crackle of distant rifle fire, all of us lost in our own thoughts, knowing that there would be another one soon, and that the next time it might be their gun that fired first. Later that night, when we parked in the cover of a shallow ravine, Feldman quietly mentioned that we had been lucky, that the T-34 must have been alone, scouting ahead, and I realized then just how much of our survival depended not on our training, or even the strength of our machine, but on chance, on weather, on terrain, on where a tank happened to be looking in the moment when both crews saw each other. That was something no manual taught us, something none of the diagrams or chalkboard lectures had ever mentioned, that war was not a clean system of inputs and outcomes, but a chaotic dance of timing, instinct and luck, and that inside the belly of a tiger, we were not gods of war, but fragile, overworked men sitting inches from ammunition, hoping that the next shot would go somewhere else. And as I lay on the metal floor that night, wrapped in my coat and using my helmet as a pillow, I listened to the soft ticking of the cooling engine, and tried not to think of the men in that other tank, whose names I'd never know, whose faces I'd never see, but whose final moment had passed so close to mine, separated only by steel and seconds. There was a morning deep in the woods outside Kharkov, when we awoke to the sound of absolute silence, and it was that silence, not the usual thrum of distant artillery or the growl of engines, that made every one of us open our eyes at the same time, as if something beyond hearing had stirred us, and for a full minute no one moved, no one spoke, we just lay still inside the Tiger, listening to nothing, which in itself felt louder than any explosion. Klaus, always the first to check things, eased the hatch open and peered out slowly, his breath fogging the cold metal rim, then motioned for the rest of us to get ready, his face pale and unreadable, and as I climbed into my gunner's position and scanned the tree line through the optics, I felt a tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with fear, and everything to do with not knowing what came next. The fog was thick that day, rolling in low and heavy like wet smoke, and the trees around us were coated in frost that made every branch glisten faintly in the weak sunlight. A sight that might have been beautiful under different circumstances, but now only added to the sense that we were not alone and not safe. Feldman gave quiet orders, each one precise and deliberate, and slowly we started the engine, the deep rumble of the Maybach sounding strangely muffled in the fog, like the growl of something hiding in a dream. We advanced slowly, our tracks crunching softly over frozen ground, the turret rotating left and right as I scanned the forest for movement, my eyes tired but sharp, and I remember thinking that this kind of tension, this waiting, this creeping forward through a gray, soundless world, was worse than any firefight, because it gave your imagination too much room to work. At one point, we passed the wreck of another German tank, maybe a Panzer IV or III. It was hard to tell through the frost and mud, and the hatch was open, one boot still hanging from the side, stiff and black with age, and no one said a word as we passed it, not even Otto, who usually muttered something half serious to cut the tension, but this time he just stared ahead, his hands gripping the radio equipment like it might anchor him to the present. Then came the echo, not of a shell or a shot, but of something metallic clinking faintly in the distance, and though it could have been anything, a tree branch falling, a dropped tool, it sent a shiver through the entire crew, because when you've lived inside a tank long enough, you develop a second sense for danger, one not based on sound or sight, but on subtle shifts in atmosphere, and every one of us felt it at once. Feldman gestured again, and we stopped, the engine idling low, the barrel of our main gun pointed toward a gap between trees, and for what felt like an hour we waited, eyes scanning shadows, ears tuned to the tiniest creak, until finally, the fog began to lift slightly, revealing nothing but more forest, more silence, more frozen ground. Still, we didn't move for a long time after that, because sometimes the absence of threat feels just as dangerous as the threat itself, and it wasn't until Klaus muttered, "Too quiet," that Feldman finally nodded, and we resumed moving, even slower than before. That day, we didn't encounter the enemy, didn't fire a single round, didn't speak more than a handful of words between us, but it remained one of the longest, heaviest days of that winter, a day that taught me that war is not always blood and thunder. Sometimes it's just silence, thick and cold and waiting, pressing against your skin until it feels like the forest itself is watching you breathe. There's a certain rhythm that life inside a Tiger tank forces upon you, not because it's comfortable or natural, but because the machinery demands it. Because once you're sealed inside that metal shell, every movement, every word, every breath becomes part of a tightly woven pattern of survival, and over time that rhythm begins to replace your own, until you wake up thinking about maintenance routines instead of dreams, and you fall asleep counting shell types instead of sheep. Each morning, if there wasn't immediate combat, we'd perform checks, fluid levels, track tension, gun alignment, radio clarity, and even though we'd done it hundreds of times, Feldman insisted we go through every step like it was the first, not out of paranoia but because, in truth, the tank didn't care how tired you were, or how well you thought you knew it. If something failed, it failed hard, and that often meant death. Heinrich, ever focused, would lay out the shells and check them by feel, rolling them slightly across his palms, his fingers knowing every groove, while Otto fine-tuned the radio frequencies, one hand on the dial, the other jotting unreadable notes in a grease-smudged notebook he never let anyone else touch. Klaus, quiet as always, would check the engine first, murmuring to it like a mechanic talks to a beloved but aging horse, and I would sit in the gunner's seat, recalibrating the optics and checking the traverse, feeling the turret shift under my legs, smooth and slow like it was breathing. Outside, the cold was constant, but inside the tank it shifted wildly, from freezing when parked, to stifling once the engine roared to life, and the metal absorbed it all, radiating discomfort into every joint and muscle until you learned to ignore it, just like you ignored the aches in your lower back, or the numbness in your fingers. Meals were whatever could be heated quickly over the engine block, bread, tins of meat, sometimes just hot water poured into dry rations, and we learned to eat with one hand, the other always close to our station, because experience had taught us that trouble rarely waited for you to finish chewing. At night, the Tiger became a cocoon of sweat and silence, each of us wrapped in coats, leaning against cold steel, speaking only if necessary, and even then in whispers, as if the war might hear us and come closer. Feldman would write in his small journal, using a pencil no longer than his thumb, and though he never shared what he wrote, I once caught a glimpse of a page filled with names, none of them ours, and I realized he was writing down the fallen, not from orders or memory, but from something personal, something he carried in silence. Sometimes, Otto would hum, barely audible over the engine's cooling tick, and Klaus would tap his fingers on the hatch like he was counting time, and I, watching the shadows dance along the turret wall, would find myself drifting between thoughts of home, of a street lamp outside my mother's window, or the way autumn smelled after rain, and the cold certainty that I might never see those things again. Inside the Tiger, you didn't have room for fear the way people outside imagined it. Instead, fear became routine, a companion that sat beside you and grew quiet with familiarity, until the only thing that truly rattled you was when everything felt too calm, too clean, too still. The first real winter we spent on the Eastern Front wasn't marked by snowstorms or dramatic blizzards, but by a kind of creeping cold that arrived slowly, seeped into your bones and never really left. Even when you were sleeping wrapped in every piece of spare cloth you owned, and inside the Tiger, the cold didn't freeze you instantly. It waited, settled into the walls and floor, turned every lever into an icicle and every surface into a place your skin stuck to if you weren't careful. And we quickly learned that even resting your hand for too long on the breech could leave a red welt that lasted for. The engine helped, of course. Once we were moving, the warmth radiated through the floor plates, making the lower half of your body sweat while your nose and ears still burned from the chill. But idling meant the temperature dropped fast, and during long ambush waits or scouting missions where we had to stay hidden, the condensation from our breath would freeze along the inside of the hatches, forming a thin glaze that glittered like glass when the first light broke through the slits. The worst part wasn't the cold itself, but how it turned even the smallest tasks into painful decisions. Reloading shells meant gripping metal casings that stole the heat from your hands in seconds. Writing coordinates down meant removing your gloves, and even relieving yourself became a battle against the elements, forcing you to open a hatch, move with frozen limbs and pray nothing happened while you were vulnerable. Heinrich once got mild frostbite on 3 of his fingers after forgetting his gloves during a sudden reposition, and though we teased him for days, none of us laughed when we saw how pale and stiff his skin had become, how his fingertips turned a waxy yellow that didn't fade for weeks. We burned extra fuel just to keep warm, something Command discouraged but never punished, because they knew what it meant to survive out here wasn't always about bullets and armor. It was about finding ways to stay human in a place that felt more and more like it had forgotten humanity entirely. Feldman began assigning warmth shifts, short periods when one of us would sit nearest to the engine exhaust or wrap their hands around a hot pipe to regain feeling. And though it seemed small, those 15-minute rotations became something we all looked forward to. A moment where you could close your eyes, feel something close to comfort, and pretend for a heartbeat that you were anywhere else. Outside, the snow deadened every sound, so that even distant gunfire felt muted, and the landscape turned into a series of soft white hills and blackened trees, as if the world had been erased and redrawn in charcoal, and often we would stare out through the vision ports and see nothing moving. Not a bird, not a breeze, just stillness so complete it felt like the earth was holding its breath. But we knew better, knew that somewhere out there, men were crouched behind logs with rifles, or creeping forward with satchel charges, waiting for the fog to lift or the wind to shift, and that every silent second was not peace, but tension winding itself tighter, coiling like a spring under the weight of ice and time. The Tiger, for all its power, could not escape the cold, and neither could we, and so we learned not to fight it, but to carry it with us, to let it remind us that we were still alive, still moving, still part of something, even if that something was a quiet, endless winter, with no name, and no end. It was during one of the longer halts, somewhere near Belgorod, that we were ordered to hold a narrow road cutting through a stretch of forest, and though it looked peaceful from a distance, just a simple path framed by pines and snow, it quickly became one of the most unsettling positions we'd ever held, not because of what we could see, but because of what we couldn't, and the way the forest seemed to breathe around us, its branches creaking in rhythms too slow to follow, like some enormous creature shifting in its sleep. We dug in behind a fallen tree line, camouflaged the tiger with branches and snow-stained canvas, and shut the engine down, letting the silence wrap itself around us like a blanket made of glass, brittle and sharp, so that even the smallest sound, a cough, a dropped wrench, felt like it echoed for miles. The command had warned us of possible Soviet infantry patrols in the area, and while we had faced infantry before, this was different, because this time, they weren't attacking us directly. They were watching, harassing, always just outside our reach, moving like ghosts through the trees, and every so often we'd hear a whistle, a short burst of fire, a rustle too rhythmic to be the wind, and then nothing again, just our breath and the hum of our own thoughts. One morning Otto picked up a transmission that was mostly static, broken German words laced with sharp bursts of Russian, and though he couldn't make out the meaning, he went pale and said, "They're listening too," and after that we spoke even less, choosing instead to communicate with taps, nods and hand signs, as if words themselves might give us away. At night we took turns on watch, one man always awake, sitting half out of the hatch with a blanket wrapped tight, scanning the tree line through fogged lenses, and when it was my turn, I remember staring so long at the same cluster of trees that I began to see movement where there was none, shapes behind branches, flickers of light that vanished the moment I blinked. Heinrich once swore he saw a man crouching beside a tree not 20 meters away, but when we all focused our scopes, there was nothing there, no tracks, no sound, no trace, and yet none of us doubted him, because by then we had all seen things that vanished, things that didn't move like soldiers or animals, but like thoughts given shape by the cold and the dark. Feldman kept his journal close, but I noticed he no longer wrote in it during those nights, only stared at the pages as if waiting for them to fill on their own, and once, as we sat in silence, he muttered, "Some woods don't want you here," and no one responded, not because we disagreed, but because we all understood exactly what he meant. It wasn't until our fourth day in that position that the first real attack came, not a full assault but a probing strike, just enough to remind us we weren't alone, and it began with a single mortar round landing 50 meters behind us, then another 30 meters ahead, and then nothing for 10 minutes, until the trees lit up with muzzle flashes and we returned fire blindly, the tiger's cannon roaring into the dark, more to scare than to destroy because we couldn't see anything, and after the echoes faded we found no bodies, no discarded gear, only the familiar silence. We stayed 2 more nights, and then the order came to move, and we left that place without a single word spoken between us, the engine groaning to life as the trees slowly disappeared in the rear viewport, and though we didn't say it out loud, I think each of us knew we'd left part of ourselves behind in that forest, something small and cold, and quietly afraid. There were moments during the long campaign eastward when the world outside the tigers stopped looking like geography and started looking like memory. Fields turned to pale, endless smears of white and gray. Villages became patterns of charred rooftops and crooked fences, and rivers were no longer lines on a map, but frozen scars across a land that seemed less like a country and more like a dream someone had abandoned halfway through. And in that dream we were simply moving shapes, repeating our routines across terrain that no longer seemed to belong to anyone. I remember one village in particular, unnamed on our map, burned and abandoned except for a single well and a scattering of broken tools that still lay neatly beside a collapsed shed, as if the people who'd used them had just stepped away for lunch and never returned, and we rolled through it slowly, the tiger's tracks carving deep lines through the frost-covered mud, no one speaking, not even Feldman, who usually gave a short note of direction or observation whenever we passed through civilian ruins. That day, though, the silence held us all, and as we moved past a shattered wagon with children's toys scattered around its wheels, I felt something hollow and strange in my chest. Not guilt, not grief, but a kind of quiet wondering at how many times a place could be destroyed before it stopped being a place at all. We parked near the well for the night, half hidden behind a collapsed barn, and while Klaus and Otto worked on checking the fuel lines, Heinrich and I wandered through what was left of the village, not out of curiosity, but because we needed to stretch our legs, feel the wind on our faces, and pretend for a few minutes that we weren't just shadows inside a machine. We didn't speak as we walked, just moved from one scorched building to the next, stepping over fallen beams and cracked plates, and I remember the crunch of glass under my boot as I paused at a doorway where someone had painted flowers, bright red and yellow, onto the frame, faded now, but still somehow cheerful against the ash. That tiny bit of color haunted me for days, not because it was sad, but because it was so defiantly human, and I kept wondering who had painted it, and whether they'd had time to run, or if they were buried now beneath the snow and splintered wood. Back at the Tiger, Feldman sat with his journal open, pencil unmoving, and when I returned he looked at me and said, "There were people here yesterday," not as a question but as a fact, and I nodded, because we all knew the front was moving fast, pushing civilians ahead of it like leaves in a stream, and even when we didn't see them we felt their absence in every empty chair, every forgotten coat, every door left swinging open in the wind. That night the cold felt sharper than usual, not in temperature but in spirit, as if the village itself was watching us, remembering us, adding us to its long list of temporary inhabitants, and I lay awake longer than usual, staring up through the hatch at the stars, which seemed too bright, too distant, like they belonged to a different world entirely. The Tiger, despite its power and armor, felt strangely fragile in moments like that, less like a fortress, and more like a shell we carried with us, a shell that kept the world out but also kept us in. Separated not just from danger, but from everything that made sense before we were soldiers. And as sleep finally took me, I remember thinking that perhaps the hardest part of war wasn't what you did or saw, it was what you had to carry with you, long after the engine cooled and the silence returned. There was a certain kind of exhaustion that settled into your body after weeks inside the Tiger. Not the sharp tiredness of a sleepless night or the ache of a long march, but a deep, slow heaviness that lived behind your eyes and inside your spine, something you didn't even feel until the rare moments when you stopped moving. And then it would wash over you like water spilling into a trench, reminding you that you hadn't truly rested in days, maybe weeks. The strange thing was that we'd grown used to it, not comfortably, but efficiently, and learned to function inside it like mechanics in low light, working by feel, instinct, repetition, until our limbs moved faster than our thoughts, and even reloading under fire felt less like panic and more like routine. But every now and then, the routine cracked, and the fatigue hit harder than usual, like it did one morning after a 36-hour reposition through freezing mud and broken roads. Our tracks jammed with ice, our boots soaked from the inside out, and Feldman finally ordered a stop. Not because we had reached our position, but because we were too tired to continue without risking a mistake. We found a shallow depression near a broken fence line, barely enough cover for the Tiger's wide body, and once the engine died, the sudden silence felt like someone had turned the world off, and for a few moments, no one moved. I stayed in the gunner's seat, staring through the empty optics, not seeing anything, not thinking, while Heinrich leaned against the ammo rack, eyes closed, arms folded, mouth slightly open like he was mid-sentence in a conversation that only existed in a dream. Klaus didn't even leave the driver's position. He simply slumped forward, hands still on the controls, his breath fogging the edge of the periscope. Otto, always the last to sleep, fiddled with the radio for a few more seconds before removing his headset and resting his head against the wall with a soft thud, his notebook slipping from his lap to the floor where it stayed, half open on a page filled with scrawled fragments of phrases none of us could decipher. Feldman climbed up into the turret, not to give orders, but just to sit, his back against the hatch, coat pulled tight, face unreadable, and for a full hour none of us spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because the silence was doing something to us, smoothing out the corners of our thoughts, numbing the edges of memory, making it just a little easier to forget where we were and what waited beyond the trees. Eventually I fell asleep in place, neck bent at an impossible angle, one hand still resting on the aiming lever, and I dreamed, not of home, not of family, but of driving through an endless white landscape with no enemy, no orders, no end, just the sound of tracks rolling over snow and the engine humming like a lullaby. When I woke, the light had shifted. The cold had deepened, and I saw Feldman still sitting above me, not asleep but not fully awake either, eyes fixed on the horizon, like he was watching something only he could see. We stayed there for nearly 6 hours, longer than command would have allowed if they'd known, but no one questioned it, because sometimes survival didn't mean moving forward, it meant pausing long enough to remember you were human. That day taught me something I never forgot, that even steel needs rest, and men even more so, and that in a war defined by motion and momentum, stillness could be the most valuable weapon we had. One of the things they never tell you when you're assigned to a tank crew is how loud silence can become, not just the silence of the world outside when the wind dies down and the trees stop moving, but the silence inside the tank, the kind that grows heavier with each passing hour during long reconnaissance missions, when the engine is off, the hatches are sealed, and all 5 of you are sitting in the dim metal belly of the beast, breathing the same recycled air, surrounded by shadows and thoughts that have nowhere to go. It was during one of those missions, 2 weeks after the village with the painted flowers, that we were ordered to hold position in an open field bordered by a copse of low trees, watching for Soviet movement reported by scouts, and from dawn until well after sunset, we didn't move a single meter. The Tiger was parked just below the crest of a small rise, engine off, turret locked forward, optics aligned, and we sat in full battle readiness, each of us at our station, eyes open, hands ready, but with nothing to do, no targets to track, no coordinates to enter, no orders to follow, only waiting. At first, the silence was welcome, a relief after the grinding roar of movement, the clatter of branches against armor, the chatter of the radio, but soon it changed, became a kind of presence itself, pushing in from all sides, amplifying the smallest sounds inside, the click of Heinrich adjusting his belt, the faint wheeze of Otto's breathing through his nose, the tiny creak of Feldman shifting his weight above the turret. My own heartbeat began to sound loud to me, louder than the wind, louder than anything, and I found myself holding my breath for short stretches just to hear what true silence actually felt like, only to release it in a slow exhale that seemed to echo against the metal walls. Time slowed in strange ways, seconds stretching like wires, minutes folding into each other, and after a while I realized I had no idea how long we had been sitting there, or if the sun had moved, or even if I had blinked in the last 10 minutes. Feldman remained perfectly still in the commander's cupola, binoculars pressed against his face for hours at a time, and I began to wonder if he'd fallen asleep with them there, frozen in place by discipline or something deeper. Otto at one point whispered something about hearing footsteps outside the hull, but when we paused and listened, there was nothing, and we chalked it up to nerves, though all of us had thought the same thing at some point during that endless day, that someone, or something, was moving just beyond our view. The sun began to set around us without ceremony, painting the horizon with dull orange light, and for a few minutes, the tank's interior was filled with a strange soft glow that made everything look older, like we were inside an ancient ruin instead of a weapon of war. When darkness finally came, Feldman gave the order to rotate the turret and restart the engine, and the noise, sudden and alive, felt like a door slamming shut on a long and fragile moment. As we rolled back into the tree line under the cover of dusk, no one said anything about what we'd seen, or hadn't seen, but we all felt it, the weight of a day when nothing had happened, but everything had shifted slightly inside us. And that was the lesson we took with us, that in war, the most dangerous days aren't always the loudest, and that sometimes, silence is not absence. It's warning. The first time we experienced a true mechanical failure in the field, it didn't come with fire or noise or anything dramatic, but with a low grinding sound from beneath the Tiger's hull, a kind of slow, tired groan that none of us had heard before, followed by a sudden lurch as if the tank had stumbled, and then silence as Klaus cut the engine and looked back at us through the narrow space that separated the driver's compartment from the rest of the crew. His expression, calm but tight, the way you look when something small might soon become something very large. We were 20 kilometers from the nearest support unit, parked in the muddy edge of a thawing field, surrounded by nothing but low brush and scattered patches of pine, and although the fighting had moved south the day before, we all knew that in a place like this, danger was never more than a few quiet moments away. Feldman climbed down into the belly, crouching beside Klaus while Otto adjusted the radio trying to get a clean signal, and Heinrich and I stood above the breach, watching them work, not really able to help but also not wanting to sit idle, because inside the Tiger, being still when something was wrong made the air feel heavier, made the silence more pointed. It turned out to be a cracked torsion bar, one of the internal springs that held the road wheels balanced against the tank's enormous weight, and while we could still move, we'd be slower, clumsier, and at risk of greater damage if the rest of the suspension gave way during rough movement. Klaus did what he could, tightening bolts, redistributing some of the weight by adjusting the track tension, but we all knew it was a patch, not a fix, and as Feldman looked over the map, marking the nearest resupply point, we felt the quiet dread settle in. We were too far from help, too exposed to weight, and too vulnerable to risk unnecessary motion. That night, we parked just off the tree line and set up a cold camp, meaning we didn't run the engine for warmth, didn't cook, didn't talk, just sat inside the Tiger, with the hatches sealed and our breath fogging in the dark, listening for any sound that didn't come from us. Every groan of the metal, every pop from the cooling engine block, felt like a threat, and though none of us said it, I know we all imagined the same thing, that somewhere nearby, a Soviet patrol might be watching, waiting, listening for signs of life inside this quiet beast of steel and smoke. Around midnight, Otto picked up faint chatter on the radio, something in Russian, maybe two voices speaking too fast to understand, and Feldman motioned for silence, his ear pressed to the headset for nearly 20 minutes, before he leaned back, exhaled slowly, and said only, "They're moving nearby." We didn't sleep that night, or if we did, it was the kind of sleep that comes in shallow breaths and opens with every creak, every flicker of wind, and when dawn broke, gray and low over the field, we decided to move, slowly, carefully, praying the torsion bar would hold long enough to get us back to safety. Every bump in the road felt amplified, every turn caused the hull to shudder, and as I sat in the gunner's seat, watching the landscape crawl by through fogged optics, I thought not of battle, not of survival but of distance, how far we were from home, from help, from everything that made sense, and how strange it was that the most fear I'd felt in months didn't come from enemy fire, but from the quiet knowledge that our machine, our shell, our only protection in this vast and hostile world, might fail us not with an explosion, but with a slow subtle crack we couldn't see and could bear. There was a night in late February, when the snow had turned from powder to ice and the roads were no longer paths but polished mirrors of frozen mud, and we found ourselves navigating a series of narrow, winding tracks through a low valley, the hills rising on both sides like dark shoulders, silent and bare, with no trees thick enough to provide cover and no way to retreat without exposing our flank. And as the sun dropped behind us and the temperature fell hard and fast, the entire world seemed to slow down, as if the cold itself were pressing against time and motion. The Tiger handled the terrain better than most vehicles, its wide tracks giving us grip where others would slide, but even then we felt the weight of each turn, the engine groaning with strain as Klaus carefully adjusted the throttle, his gloved hands white-knuckled on the controls, while Feldman stood half out of the hatch with binoculars in hand, scanning the ridgelines for signs of movement, because we all knew this kind of terrain favored ambushes, and if there were anti-tank guns waiting, we wouldn't see them until the first shell hit. As we crawled through that valley, barely above idle speed, I stayed locked to the scope, sweeping left to right, searching for anything that broke the smooth rhythm of the landscape, an unnatural shadow, a flash of glass, the silhouette of a man holding still in the snow, and the longer I looked, the more the valley seemed to shift, as if the terrain itself was alive, watching us pass through it like an animal watching prey. Heinrich sat just behind me, rotating shells through the ready rack, checking their casings for frostbite cracks, whispering numbers to himself like a prayer or a checklist, and Otto said nothing for over an hour, eyes fixed on the radio dials, hands poised, as though he was waiting for a voice to emerge from the static, something that would confirm we weren't as alone as we felt. Eventually Feldman ordered a halt, just beneath a slight curve in the road where the banks rose high enough to conceal us from the next bend, and we shut the engine off, letting the silence rush in all at once, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring with the ghost of sound. We sat like that for maybe 40 minutes, breathing steam into our scarves, watching the light fade, until it became clear we weren't moving again that night, not safely, and so we settled in, the taiga becoming our home once more, cold and cramped but secure, our metal cocoon in a world that had no warmth left to offer. Around midnight Klaus and I traded watch. He climbed back into the hull to rest, and I took his place in the hatch, wrapped in 2 coats and half a blanket, my rifle balanced across my knees, listening for any movement, eyes half closed against the wind that whispered through the valley like an old voice, telling stories no one wanted to remember. I must have drifted, because I startled awake to a faint rustle from the slope above us, a sound so soft it could have been snow falling from a branch or the brush of a coat against dry bark, and I froze, heart pounding, scanning the ridge with every nerve on fire, but saw nothing, just shadow and snow and the curve of the world holding its breath. Still, I waited, and when nothing more came I climbed back inside, gently closed the hatch and said nothing, because whether it had been a bird, a soldier, or my own exhausted imagination, it didn't matter. The fear had done its job, reminding me that the valley wasn't ours, that no place was, not really, and that we were always passing through someone else's silence. In the morning, we moved again, engine coughing to life in the freezing air, and as we turned the next bend, we saw tracks, fresh ones, boot prints in the snow leading away from the road and up the opposite ridge, and no one needed to say a word. The valley had been watching. There were days when the weather did more to shape the course of our lives than any battle plan ever could, and one of the worst began with sleet that hit the taiga like a rain of glass, each droplet freezing instantly against the armor, turning the hull into a shifting mosaic of ice that made every surface slick, every hatch heavy and stubborn. And though we'd grown used to the way the Eastern Front could change moods without warning, there was something about that particular storm that made the cold feel personal, like it wasn't just nature but some ancient force trying to force us back, reminding us that machines don't belong in places like this. We were ordered to hold a crossroads near a partially collapsed farmhouse that barely stood upright, its roof already caved in from an earlier shelling, and the rest of the landscape was open and low, with only skeletal trees and blackened fence posts to mark the boundaries between one patch of frozen dirt and another. It wasn't a strategic position, not really, it wasn't even paved, but our orders were to sit there for 24 hours and report any Soviet movement, and so we did what we always did. We parked, camouflaged as best we could, shut down the engine, and prepared to wait. Inside, the air became damp and thick, our breath turning to frost on the walls, and even with all 5 of us pressed into our usual spots, the cold felt tighter than usual, less like a presence, and more like a weight. Something pushing against our ribs and curling into our hands, and before long the condensation from our own breathing began dripping from the ceiling in slow, steady drops. Klaus tried to boil water using the exhaust pipe before we shut down, but it cooled too fast, and we ended up eating cold rations. Cheese turned to stone, bread crumbling like dry clay, and a tin of meat that no one could open until Heinrich found an old bullet casing to use as a lever. I sat in the gunner's seat, legs pulled up tight, staring through the fogged optic slit, not really seeing anything but knowing I had to keep looking, because if I stopped, even for a second, my thoughts would drift, and drifting thoughts in that kind of stillness could turn dangerous. Feldman read from a thin book he carried, its cover long torn away, his voice low and calm, just enough to remind us that we were still people, that we still had language, even if the words no longer carried much weight. Otto wrote something in his notebook, not glancing up once in over an hour, his pencil moving steadily across the page in tiny, sharp lines, and I wondered what he could be recording. Positions, memories, or just a list of things he hoped to survive long enough to forget. Around dusk, the sleet turned to snow, thick and wet, sticking to everything, and we took turns brushing it off the vision ports and the turret ring, because if that froze, we'd lose rotation, and if we lost rotation, the taiga became a coffin. The farmhouse behind us groaned under the weight of the storm, and somewhere inside its half-collapsed walls, we heard something fall. A beam, a bucket, maybe nothing at all. But it reminded us that everything here was rotting slowly, breaking apart piece by piece, and that our steel wasn't immune to the same fate. At some point during the night, Klaus asked if anyone remembered what birds sounded like, and we all went quiet, because none of us did. Not really. Not in a way we could describe. And that small realization, that something so simple had vanished from our memory, felt heavier than the storm itself. We made it through the night without contact, without movement, without even a sound beyond the wind. And when the order came at dawn to move north, we felt not relief but hesitation, as if leaving that frozen crossing meant abandoning something behind. Some version of ourselves that had sat quietly, endured the cold, and learned once again that survival in this place was not always about fire or steel, but about how long you could sit in silence and still remember you were alive. The first time we encountered the aftermath of a retreat, we didn't understand what we were looking at. Not immediately, because the snow had covered everything in such a clean, even layer that it looked almost untouched, like a quiet postcard from nowhere. But as we rolled forward, the illusion broke, and the field around us became a scattered collage of blackened gear, twisted steel, shattered crates, and the remnants of what had once been a supply convoy caught during withdrawal, its wagons reduced to burned ribs of wood and its horses long frozen in place, their bodies half buried under the drifting snow. Feldman told us to stop, his voice sharp but calm, and we halted just behind a ridge of churned-up earth, the tiger's weight pressing into the ice with a groan that echoed longer than it should have, and for several minutes none of us spoke, because something about the scene demanded silence, not out of fear, but out of respect, or maybe shock. I scanned the field through the scope and saw what looked like dozens of crates scattered across the snow, some broken open, their contents spilling out in strange, sad piles. Boots, clothing, broken helmets, a shattered radio set, even a child's toy, a carved wooden horse with one leg missing, lying face down beside a crushed lantern. And I realized, suddenly and without meaning to, that someone must have carried that toy all this way. Maybe a soldier's keepsake, or a civilian trying to hold on to something human. Heinrich climbed out briefly to walk the edge of the wreckage, rifle slung over his shoulder, and I watched him pause near what looked like a cooking pot, still upright, now filled with snow instead of food. And when he came back he didn't say anything, just handed Otto a small metal tag he'd found, and then sat in his corner, rubbing his hands together as if trying to erase the cold that had sunk deeper than his gloves. Klaus asked if we should report it, and Feldman shook his head slowly, replying, "There's no one left to report to," and I understood what he meant. Not that command wouldn't care, but that this kind of loss had become routine, expected, almost meaningless in the larger rhythm of the war. We moved on after an hour, tracks grinding through the snow and across frozen wood and canvas, and the sound was different. Less like motion, more like dragging, like we were pulling the memory of what we'd seen behind us, letting it stretch out across the trail until it became part of the road itself. That night, when we stopped near a line of leafless trees, I kept thinking about that wooden horse, about how it had ended up there, so far from wherever it was carved, and whether the person who brought it had survived, or if they were just another shape buried beneath the snow, unnamed and unseen. Otto added a few lines to his notebook, and closed it with more care than usual, while Feldman sat for a long time staring at the stars, his breath rising in thin clouds, hands resting on his knees, like someone waiting for news that would never come. The tiger groaned as the metal cooled, ticking in slow, uneven rhythms, and even though I was wrapped in every coat I owned, I couldn't shake the feeling that the cold we carried now wasn't just weather, it was memory, and it would travel with us long after this part of the front moved on. By the time March arrived, the ground had begun to thaw in patches, not enough to bring warmth, but just enough to turn the snow into a thin, brown slush that stuck to everything, and made the roads into ribbons of mud that clung to the tiger's tracks like chains, dragging us slower with each kilometer. And though most of us had looked forward to the end of deep winter, the arrival of spring brought a different kind of misery, softer, wetter, and far more unpredictable. The worst part wasn't the rain or the mud itself, but the way it hid everything beneath it, from jagged metal scraps to half-sunken mines, and the feeling of driving became less about direction and more about trust. Trust in Klaus to feel the texture of the ground through the controls, Trust in the suspension to hold, trust in the land to let us pass. One afternoon, as we rolled across a narrow farm road flanked by ditches swollen with snowmelt, the tank suddenly dipped forward with a groan, one side dropping hard as the right front track collapsed into a soft patch of earth that gave way beneath the weight, swallowing half the wheel in muck and nearly throwing Otto from his seat as he braced against the wall. Klaus immediately cut the engine and climbed out to assess the damage, boots sinking into the mess with a sickening squelch while the rest of us prepared for the long, slow process of digging and jacking the track clear, something that took hours under the best conditions, and even longer when your hands were frozen, the wind wouldn't stop, and every movement felt like wrestling with the earth itself. We worked in shifts, 2 men digging while the others rested inside, rotating every 40 minutes to keep our strength, and it wasn't long before our gloves were soaked through, fingers stiff and numb, and every tool we touched felt like holding onto ice. Heinrich cut his palm on a shard of metal buried beneath the soil, and though it wasn't deep, we had no clean bandages left, so we wrapped it with a strip of cloth torn from an old undershirt, and he kept working without a word, his face tight, breath coming in short, sharp bursts. Otto, meanwhile, stayed mostly silent, helping where he could, but spending much of the time with the radio, trying to reach a support unit that never answered, his voice growing quieter with each call, until he gave up and simply sat back, eyes closed, headset resting on his shoulder. By dusk we had managed to clear enough of the mud to reposition the Tiger, Klaus maneuvering with painful slowness, inch by inch, while Feldman and I watched from either side, signaling with hands and short whistles to guide the movement. When the tank finally lurched free with a wet snap, we all stood still for a moment, just breathing, not cheering, not celebrating, just breathing like men who had nearly been buried alive and knew it. That night, we didn't bother setting camp properly, just stayed inside, doors sealed, exhaustion settling over us like a blanket too heavy to remove, and for the first time in weeks no one said a single word before falling asleep. I remember waking up later, sometime around midnight, and hearing rain pattering softly against the hull, and instead of feeling dread, I felt something close to peace, not because we were safe, but because the sound was gentle, real, and somehow untouched by war. It was a reminder that the world still existed beyond the mud, beyond the tank, beyond the fight, and in a place like that, reminders like that were rare and precious. There were rare days on the front when the sun broke through the clouds, not in full warmth but just enough to cast long shadows and make the steel of the Tiger gleam dully under the light. And on those days something shifted in us. Not hope exactly, not joy, but a kind of quiet permission to feel human for a little while. As though the world had remembered it was supposed to have seasons, colors, and softness, even out here where everything else was rusted and gray. One of those days came after a week of endless repositioning, command sending us from one patch of mud to another in what felt like a slow retreat master's movement. And when we finally reached a small plateau overlooking a frozen river, Feldman decided we'd stay the night there, even if only to give the crew a break and the engine a chance to cool without smoke rising into the open air. The spot was oddly beautiful. Birch trees with peeling white bark lined the ridge behind us, and the river below sparkled faintly where the ice had begun to crack into irregular sheets, the water beneath dark and slow like oil moving under glass. For the first time in weeks we sat outside the Tiger for longer than a few minutes, our coats off, soaking in what little warmth we could, as Klaus cleaned the mud from the drive wheels, and Heinrich carefully polished the optics, even though no inspection was due. Otto found a dry log and sat scribbling in his notebook, while Feldman climbed a small rise and stood with his hands behind his back, staring at the horizon, like he was waiting for something to appear. I took the moment to walk a few meters beyond the tank, past a pile of broken fencing, and looked down at the river, watching it move and shift, the sound of cracking ice like distant gunfire, sharp, sudden, but strangely soothing. I found myself thinking about home, not in the way I usually did, which was abstract and foggy, but in vivid, ordinary fragments. The way the floor in our kitchen creaked near the window, the smell of coal dust on my father's coat, the sound of spoons in a drawer. It hit me so hard I had to sit down, the weight of it all making my knees weak, not from sadness, but from the strange disbelief that those things had ever truly existed, that I had once been part of something that wasn't moving, watching, or bracing for impact. Back at the tank, the others began preparing a small fire, and we ate something warm for the first time in days. Coffee made thick with bits of ash, bread softened over the flame, and a single tin of beans that we passed around like it was treasure. Feldman allowed a small radio broadcast to play while we ate, just static and fragments of an orchestral piece, distorted but recognizable, and I remember the moment when a single violin broke through, clear and soft, and we all stopped chewing, just listening, like children hearing a lullaby through the wall of a house they barely remembered living in. When the music faded, no one spoke, and instead of restarting the engine or resuming the endless routine, we simply sat there as the light faded and the stars began to appear, one by one, above the trees. That night we slept with the hatches cracked open, the air cold but fresh, and though we still kept watch in pairs, something had shifted, not in the war, not in our orders, but inside us. It was a reminder that we weren't just surviving machines in a steel box. We were men who once had homes, faces, memories, and even if the world was trying to erase that piece by piece, we still carried it, quietly, stubbornly, and sometimes, on days like that, we even let ourselves feel it. It was sometime in early April when the rumors began to filter through the radio. Disjointed, contradictory reports about an upcoming offensive, whispered names of distant cities we'd never seen, half-spoken mentions of units moving east faster than expected, and though Feldman never said much about the chatter he picked up, we could tell by the way he started checking the maps more often, rereading old dispatches, and quietly revising our spare fuel rations that something larger was unfolding beyond our immediate orders. That uncertainty settled into the Tiger like an extra crew member, silent but heavy, riding with us through the frost-lined woods and shallow riverbeds. And even when nothing had changed officially, we all began to prepare for what we didn't yet understand, checking every round twice, brushing rust from connections we'd ignored for weeks, cutting our sleep shorter so we could spend more time scanning the tree line. The air itself felt different, the way it does just before a storm, thick with a pressure you can't explain, and even the birds, those few that had returned, seemed to move quieter through the branches, as if the trees themselves were listening. On one long stretch of open road, we passed a field where another Tiger had broken down, its crew gone, engine compartment stripped for parts, turret left facing sideways like a dead animal frozen mid-step. And though we didn't stop, we slowed, all of us staring as we passed, not because it was unusual, but because it looked so much like us, like we were looking into a mirror that showed tomorrow. That night, we made camp earlier than usual, beneath the shelter of a half-destroyed farmhouse, with only 3 walls left standing, and though we were technically within friendly lines, no one let down their guard. Klaus and I kept watch longer than we needed to, and Otto barely touched his food, his pencil tapping against the spine of his notebook in an uneven rhythm. Heinrich cleaned each shell in silence, using a rag that had once been part of his winter coat, rubbing until the brass shone, even though it would be blackened again after a single shot. When we finally tried to sleep, the wind began to rise, pulling through the broken boards like whispers, and I lay there on the turret floor, staring at the ceiling, trying to imagine what it would look like if we had to fight here, in this place, with its weak walls and open sky, and the image that came to mind wasn't of gunfire or smoke, but of a single mistake, one missed signal, one delayed reaction, and the realization that this machine we lived inside, for all its steel and firepower, could still become a tomb in a matter of seconds. Feldman said something quiet just before he drifted off, a line I don't think he meant for anyone to hear. We're not fighting to win anymore, we're just fighting not to disappear. I didn't answer, but those words stuck with me, echoing into the silence that followed, and long after the others had fallen asleep, I found myself replaying them in my mind, not because I feared they were true, but because I knew they already were. In the morning, we moved on before the sun had fully risen, tracks grinding over frosted earth, smoke from the engine curling into the pale sky, And as the road twisted ahead of us and the rumors continued to build like distant thunder, I realized we weren't waiting for the next battle anymore. We were already inside it, every day, every hour, and all that remained was to keep going, keep breathing, and hope the road ahead was long enough to give us one more quiet night. The battle that finally came didn't arrive the way we expected it. Not with sirens or artillery barrages or columns of tanks rolling across open fields, but with silence that suddenly ended, as if someone had flicked a switch inside the landscape and turned everything violent at once, and we found ourselves thrown into a firefight so chaotic and fast that most of the details only came back later, in fragments, scattered images that never quite reassembled into a full picture. We had been positioned near a railway junction west of Kharkov, covering a narrow approach road with a pair of panzers behind us, and a squad of infantry dug in among the rail cars, and though the morning had been calm, with nothing but wind rustling through the high grass and birds circling overhead, the first shell landed without warning, hitting 20 meters to our left and lifting a cloud of earth so dense that I couldn't see the optics for several seconds. Feldman shouted something, orders maybe, or just my name, but I was already moving, hands flying across the controls, rotating the turret toward the tree line where the flash had come from, and through the clearing smoke I caught the shape of a Soviet Su-85, its gun leveled and already shifting toward us. I don't remember aiming, not really, just muscle memory, training, instinct, and the main gun fired with a roar that shook the entire hull, and even before the smoke cleared, I was reaching for the next shell, Heinrich already handing it up, his face pale but steady. The Soviet tank never fired its second shot. We hit it square in the front plate, and it crumpled like a tin can, flames blooming from the rear deck as crewmen scattered from the other side of the ridge, some running, some falling before they could. But there was no time to watch. More targets were emerging, shadows moving fast along the edge of the woods, and I heard Klaus curse as something pinged hard off the side of our hull, the sound sharp and terrifyingly close. Otto screamed something into the radio. Coordinates, call signs, I don't remember. And then the infantry were shouting too, calling for cover, for fire support, for anything. And I just kept turning, aiming, firing, loading, the world shrinking down to the breath between each round. At one point, we rolled forward to get a better line of sight, and the Tiger crushed something beneath us. Wood, maybe metal, I didn't look, and the sudden shift in angle made the next shot land wide, exploding in a spray of dirt that almost blinded our left port. Feldman adjusted immediately, barking adjustments, calm despite the chaos, and I followed them without thinking, the rhythm of command and reaction taking over. Because in moments like that, there's no time for fear or thought, only for function. The fight lasted perhaps 10 minutes, maybe 20, I still don't know. But by the time it ended, the field was littered with smoke and broken machinery, the air thick with the acrid stench of burning fuel and singed earth. One of the panzers behind us was gone, its turret blown clean off, and resting several meters away from the hull, and two of our supporting infantry squads had been reduced to less than half strength, medics working silently, under a cloud of black smoke. When we finally stopped moving, and the engine cooled enough to let the silence return, it wasn't relief that followed, it was weight, a crushing exhaustion that made even breathing feel like work, and as I sat in the gunner's seat, hands trembling, sweat running down my back despite the cold, I realized I couldn't remember how many shells we had fired, or how many men I had seen fall. That night, we didn't talk, we just sat inside the Tiger, heads bowed, each of us holding the silence like it was something fragile, and even Feldman didn't write in his journal. Because sometimes, after a battle, the only thing you can do is sit still, and try not to remember too much. The days following the firefight blurred together in a haze of smoke, repair work, and unspoken thoughts that hung in the air like ash, because while the Tiger had survived the engagement with only minor damage, a cracked periscope, some cosmetic scarring on the turret ring, and a jammed hatch hinge, the same couldn't be said for everything and everyone else around us, and as we moved eastward in staggered formations, the weight of that silence began to settle into our bones, changing not how we moved, but how we carried ourselves when we weren't moving. The replacement crews who joined our convoy looked younger than we remembered being, their faces sunburned and unsure, some of them barely speaking as they rode past us in open-top trucks, gripping rifles like questions they were afraid to ask, and I could see in their eyes what I had once seen in mine. The belief that armor and weapons made you safer, that being inside a tiger meant control, power, maybe even protection. But I knew better now. We all did. Klaus drove slower than usual during those days, not because the terrain demanded it, but because we'd all grown cautious, superstitious even, treating every road as if it hid a mine, every tree line as if it masked a threat, and every silence as if it were the breath before an explosion. Feldman spent more time with his map than with his binoculars, eyes scanning lines as if they might reveal more than orders, like they might offer a route out, or at least a pause in the madness. Heinrich, who once hummed to himself while preparing rounds, now worked in complete silence, eyes down, motions precise, like he was afraid to disturb something invisible. Otto stopped writing. He still carried his notebook, still opened it, but he stopped writing, choosing instead to draw tiny symbols in the corners, patterns, spirals, jagged loops, and when I asked him once what they meant, he looked at me like he didn't understand the question and turned away. One afternoon, as we paused in a field outside a half-destroyed village, Feldman gathered us behind the tiger and read out a set of new instructions. Simple, routine repositioning. And when he finished, no one moved for a few seconds, each of us standing in the low sun, faces pale beneath soot and grime. And then he said something none of us expected. "We're going to make it through this. I don't know how, but we are." It wasn't the kind of speech commanders give. It wasn't confident or commanding or even certain. But it was real. And for a moment, I believed him. Not because he sounded sure, but because he sounded tired, just like the rest of us. And I realized that maybe that's what survival was now. Not a strategy, not a guarantee, just the refusal to stop. The decision to keep moving even when your body told you to lie down and let the cold have you. That night, as we parked on a ridge and watched the sky darken over the low hills, Klaus shared a piece of chocolate someone had sent him in a care package weeks ago, half melted and crumbly, and we passed it around like a relic, each of us taking a piece, savoring the taste not because it was sweet, but because it wasn't the front. It wasn't iron, oil, or ash. And for those few seconds we weren't gunners or commanders or loaders or drivers. We were men, alive, together, and still breathing. We had learned by then that war was not measured in victories nor even in losses, but in the strange, quiet stretches between both. Those long grey hours when nothing happened, when the tank sat still beneath a sagging tarp or under a scrim of wet branches, engines silent, crew half awake, listening to the world through steel and memory, and wondering not when the next battle would come, but what part of us it would try to take. One of those days came as we waited outside a small crossroads south of Poltava. The tiger nestled between the bare remains of two brick buildings that had long since lost their roofs, their windows broken into crooked mouths that stared back at us through wind and dust. And though our orders were to hold and observe, there was no one left to observe. No civilians, no scouts, not even wildlife. Only the shifting breeze, and the long grass bending toward nothing. Otto was the first to say what we were all thinking, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think the war has already left this place." And though Feldman didn't respond, he didn't contradict him either, and in that silence, I felt the strange truth of it settle inside me, heavy and cold. We used the downtime to perform full maintenance, scraping out the mud from the track guards, relubricating the turret traverse ring, inspecting the gearbox. And though our hands moved with purpose, the motions felt hollow, like rituals carried out by people who no longer believed in what they were preserving. I took the chance to climb up onto the turret during a break and scanned the horizon with the binoculars, not because I expected to see anything, but because it gave me something to do, and as I watched the wind ripple through a distant wheat field, I imagined for a moment that I was a farmer again, or maybe just someone passing through, and the image of the tiger behind me, the smoke-blackened barrel, the rusted bolts, the dirty canvas flapping in the wind, looked more like a monument than a weapon. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low, and the sky turned the color of old blood, Klaus lit a small fire just inside one of the ruined walls, shielding it with a piece of scrap metal. And we gathered around it more for the sound than the heat, listening to the quiet crackle, each of us staring into it like it might speak. Heinrich shared a story about his brother, something simple about the time they stole apples from a neighbor's tree, and were chased for 3 streets by a man with a broom, and though no one laughed out loud, we all smiled, not because the story was funny, but because it was real, human, tethered to a time when fear came from old men with brooms instead of artillery shells and sudden silence. Feldman finally took out his journal again that night, and wrote for a long time, longer than usual, and when he was done, he didn't close it immediately, just stared at the last page like he wasn't sure if he'd written enough, or maybe too much. As darkness fell and the fire died, we climbed back into the Tiger and took our usual positions, heads resting on metal, breath clouding the air, and as I listened to Otto's slow breathing, the tick of cooling steel, the wind whispering through the broken buildings outside, I realized something that stuck with me even as sleep came. The hardest part of the war wasn't the noise, or even the killing. It was the moments like this, when nothing happened, when you remembered too much, and when all that silence left you alone with everything. By the time we received the next set of orders, something in us had changed. Not suddenly, not with drama or collapse, but quietly, subtly, like rust growing under paint, or water seeping into stone. And though we still followed commands, still checked coordinates and loaded shells and rotated the turret on cue, we did it with the hollow rhythm of men who had stopped expecting to return. Men who no longer pictured the end of the road as home, but simply as somewhere else. Maybe quieter, maybe colder, but different. The directive came in just after dawn. We were to proceed south to a supply junction where reports had come in of sabotage and potential partisan movement. And though the map showed a simple route, forest, hills, a shallow river crossing, none of us trusted it. Not after the last few weeks of terrain that had looked harmless and turned to traps, ambushes, and vanished units. Feldman marked the route, said little, and handed the map to Klaus without comment, and by mid-morning the Tiger was moving again, slower than usual, due to a developing issue with the left side track link, which kept slipping slightly on turns, and made every maneuver feel tight and uncertain. As we moved deeper into the trees, the light dimmed, the canopy overhead thick with early spring leaves that hadn't been there just days ago, and for a long stretch we said nothing, only the sound of the engine, and the occasional clatter of a loose bolt somewhere behind the transmission filling the air. Heinrich kept checking the ready rack more often than necessary, as if waiting for something to go wrong, while Otto adjusted the radio with a kind of quiet desperation, cycling through frequencies that returned only static, and the occasional broken transmission that made less sense the more we listened. Just past noon, the road dipped into a shallow ravine, and as we descended, the tank's weight made the mud squelch and groan beneath us, the hull lurching slightly as the suspension compressed, and all at once we stopped, not by choice but by something unseen, a sudden jolt that threw Klaus forward and made the whole crew stiffen. At first we thought it was mechanical, another snapped torsion bar, or a collapsed roadbed, but when Klaus checked and found nothing visible, and when Feldman scanned the ridge and gave no signal, we all felt it at once. Something was wrong. The silence was too thick, too complete, and the air felt heavy, as if waiting. I peered through the scope, slowly sweeping the ridgelines, but saw nothing. No movement, no light, no glint of optics or barrel. But I knew. We all did. It was the feeling you get just before it starts. The pause before an ambush. The breath before impact. Feldman didn't wait. He ordered full reversal, and Klaus began backing the Tiger up the slope, slowly, cautiously, our eyes never leaving the edges of the trees. We reached the ridge again without incident, but none of us spoke until we were clear, and even then, it was Otto who broke the silence first, saying only, "They were there." We didn't need proof. We believed him. That night, we camped beneath a ruined bridge outside a burned village and kept full watch in rotating shifts, 2 awake at all times. And while nothing came for us in the dark, the silence did, settling into the tank like a second atmosphere, heavier than the steel around us. As I lay awake, listening to the low hum of the idling battery, I thought about how many times we had escaped things we never saw, how many men we might have passed in the trees, watching, waiting, choosing not to pull the trigger, and how that choice, or its absence, had become the difference between life and death more than any gun or order. And in that realization, I found a strange kind of fear, not of battle, but of the spaces between, of how much death now depended on silence, on timing, on the invisible decisions of people we would never meet. We woke to the sound of birds. That alone was enough to unsettle us, because it had been so long since nature made a sound louder than us, so long since the trees dared speak before the engines did. And as I sat up, blinking at the pale sky visible through the hatch, I felt something strange settle in my chest. Not hope exactly, but an odd stillness, a quiet that wasn't imposed by fear or exhaustion, but one that simply existed, like a morning that had forgotten where it was. Klaus was already up, walking the perimeter with a cigarette half burned and dangling from his lips, eyes scanning the tree line with the habitual sweep of someone who no longer trusted peace. And when I joined him, we stood in silence, letting the weak sunlight try to soak into our jackets. Otto had built a small fire behind the Tiger's rear hull plate, hidden from view but close enough to the engine block to catch residual warmth, and Heinrich, still groggy, was crouched over it, stirring something in a tin. Probably meat, maybe coffee, maybe both, because at this point, taste mattered less than heat. Feldman, unusually quiet, sat on the track with the map folded neatly in his lap, staring not at the paper but at the horizon, as if searching for a path that hadn't been drawn yet, or maybe one that had disappeared. We weren't moving that day, at least not yet, because the replacement part we needed for the left track had been delayed, and although we could have limped forward, Command had given us permission to hold until midday. That sort of grace was rare and unnerving. I used the time to do something I hadn't done in weeks. I took out a pencil stub from my coat pocket and a scrap of paper torn from a maintenance manual, and I began to write, not a report, not a log, not even a letter, but simply words, disconnected and floating. Snow, silence, flame, mother, boots, brass, never, maybe. I didn't know what I was trying to say, only that I needed to say something before I forgot how. Heinrich noticed, and didn't comment. Instead, he reached into his pack and pulled out a folded photograph, creased, stained, nearly torn in two, and handed it to me without a word. It was a woman and a boy, standing beside a tree, both squinting in sunlight, both smiling in that open, casual way that only exists far from war. I gave it back gently, nodding once, and we didn't speak after that. Around noon, Feldman received word that the convoy had changed course, that we were now to reroute north by northwest, to link with a retreating supply line. And though the news should have made us tense, it almost felt like a relief. At least movement meant direction. And direction, however uncertain, was better than stillness that lasted too long. As we prepared the Tiger, double-checking the suspension and brushing frost off the vision slits, I caught myself humming a fragment of a lullaby my mother used to sing when I was small, long before uniforms and engines, and it startled me so much that I stopped mid-note, looking around to see if anyone had heard. No one had, or if they had, they said nothing. We rolled out slowly, the repaired track clunking a little too loudly, the road narrow and uneven, but the sky above us stayed clear, and the birds, though fewer now, continued to call in the distance, their voices sharp, real, strange. For the first time in a while, I looked up at the clouds instead of the tree line, and for a few quiet minutes, I wasn't a gunner, or a soldier, or a shadow moving across a map. I was just a man inside a shell of metal, listening to the wind, hoping the road ahead was longer than it looked. The road north was narrow and slow, a winding cut through low hills and thawing farmland that had once been fields of barley or rye, now reduced to mud and skeletal fences that leaned like drunks against the wind. And as we moved, the landscape grew quieter with each kilometer, not because we were farther from the front, but because whatever had passed through here before us had taken everything with it. People, livestock, signs, even names. Villages were reduced to outlines, fireplaces standing where homes had once been, and wells capped with boards so old they snapped under the weight of snow. And though we didn't stop, I watched each ruin carefully through the scope, searching not for threats but for something, anything, that felt alive. The Tiger rolled on without complaint, its engine humming with that low, familiar growl that seemed part machine and part beast, and as I sat in the gunner's seat, legs cramped, hands resting near the traverse wheel, I began to wonder how many days I had spent in this exact position, how many hours I had watched the world through 3 inches of glass, waiting for movement, waiting for a reason to pull the trigger. Otto kept the radio active, half listening to the static and half watching the road behind us, while Heinrich made marks in a small notebook I hadn't seen before, different from the one Otto used, filled with numbers, sketches of shells, notes about barrel heat and loading times. When I asked him why he was tracking that now, after all this time, he said, "Because if we don't remember what we did, no one else will." And though I didn't respond, the thought stayed with me for the rest of the day. We passed an old barn near dusk, its roof half gone, its doors swinging in the breeze like open hands, and Feldman ordered a stop, not for rest, but for cover, because the road ahead curved through a low valley, and he didn't like the sightlines. We parked the Tiger behind a rise of earth, engine off, vision slits cracked, and waited while the light drained from the sky, the colors fading into a flat blue-gray that made the whole world look like a photograph left in the rain. Klaus brewed coffee using melted snow and the exhaust pipe, the smell bitter but comforting, and we drank in silence, passing the canteen like a ritual, each of us pausing longer between sips, as though the warmth might last longer if we moved slower. At one point, Feldman climbed onto the roof of the Tiger and sat there, legs dangling over the side, eyes scanning the road without binoculars, just watching, and when I joined him he said softly, "There's no glory in what we're doing. Just endurance." I nodded, not because I agreed or disagreed, but because it felt like the only thing to do, and we sat there until the wind grew sharp and the stars began to show, faint and cold above the tree line. That night, I couldn't sleep, not from fear, but from the strange aching quiet that filled the tank, the kind of quiet that made your thoughts echo louder than any shell ever could. I thought of my mother's hands, of a dog we had when I was 6, of the way bread used to smell when it came out of the oven. I thought of the men we had passed on the road, some waving, some staring, some missing, and I wondered where they were now, alive, dead, or somewhere in between. The Tiger creaked softly as the metal cooled, and I lay there with my eyes open, watching the shadows shift across the interior, thinking that maybe that's all we were now. Shadows in motion, waiting for someone to remember we were here. Morning came gray and quiet, with mist crawling low over the valley floor and frost clinging to every exposed surface of the Tiger, like the breath of something old and watchful. And as we resumed our course along the winding dirt road, every creak of the track and whine of the engine sounded too loud, too exposed, as if the fog wasn't just hiding the landscape but listening. Feldman gave no spoken orders that morning, only gestures, a raised hand, a tapped knuckle, a slow nod, and each of us moved accordingly, our routines by now so ingrained that we barely needed words to operate. Klaus drove with a kind of calm urgency, never stopping, but never rushing, hands steady on the levers, eyes flicking between the muddy road and the hazy silhouettes of trees drifting in and out of the mist like ghosts. Heinrich, quiet as ever, sat beside the ready rack, one hand resting on the shell clamps, the other holding a pencil stub that he tapped occasionally against his knee, keeping time with something only he could hear. Otto adjusted the radio every 20 minutes, not expecting a signal but checking anyway, and when the static shifted slightly around midday, he paused, leaned in, and listened for a full minute before shaking his head once and returning to his seat. I stayed fixed to the gunner's scope for most of the morning, my vision reduced to a thin horizontal slit of fog and faint outlines, and after a while, the forest ahead began to look like it was breathing, trees rising and fading in rhythm, as if exhaling around us. It wasn't long before the engine began to stutter, not a failure, just the cold and the incline pulling against each other, and we came to a slow halt near a bend where the road narrowed between two low embankments. Feldman motioned for a full stop, climbed halfway out of the hatch, and scanned the tree line with his binoculars, while Otto checked the map, and muttered something about high ground to the west. I turned the turret slightly, adjusting for visibility, and then I saw it. Not an enemy, not a weapon, but something that froze me more than either. A wooden cross, leaning at an angle, tied with wire and half buried in the frost, its base surrounded by a few scattered personal items, a spoon, a torn satchel, a rusted belt buckle. It wasn't the first grave we'd passed, not by a long stretch, but something about its position, right there on the roadside, close enough to touch, with no attempt at camouflage, felt different, deliberate, like it had been left for us to see. I pointed it out to Feldman, who nodded once, slowly, and we moved on without speaking of it. That night when we camped under a collapsed railway bridge, no one mentioned the cross, but I know we all saw it again in our heads, again and again, not because it was unusual, but because it was ordinary, because it reminded us that this road we were on had been traveled before, by men just like us, and that some of them had stopped, not because they reached the end of their mission, but because the earth simply refused to let them pass. As the fire crackled and Otto quietly tuned the radio, catching a few seconds of a song none of us could name, I sat with my back against the Tiger's hull and stared at the sky, wondering how many more roads lay ahead, and how many more crosses waited for us around their bends. By the time we reached the outskirts of the junction town we'd been sent to secure, the landscape had begun to open up again. Wide fields of brittle, wind-blown grass and patches of thin birch, the trees leaning slightly from months of hard weather and artillery tremors, and though the air was warmer now and the snow mostly gone, none of us trusted the change, because on the eastern front, a clear sky often meant an incoming storm, and silence was rarely anything but a prelude. The town itself had already been fought over twice in the last year, and what remained was less a settlement than a suggestion. Stone foundations where homes once stood, smoke-blackened chimneys like fingers jutting from the earth, and a single rail track running through the center, twisted in places, the wooden ties broken like bones. As we rolled slowly into position near a collapsed warehouse, the Tiger's engine low and grumbling, I scanned what was left of the streets through my scope and saw nothing moving, only debris and shadow and the occasional flicker of light on broken glass. Feldman ordered us to hold, to wait for the infantry column to arrive behind us, and we parked beneath the frame of an old loading crane, its rusted hooks swaying slightly in the wind like they still remembered work. While we waited, Otto ran a full systems check. Heinrich reorganized the ammunition rack for the third time in as many days, and Klaus took the opportunity to clean the filters and scrape the last of the winter grime from the front hatches. I climbed up onto the turret, binoculars in hand, and watched the horizon, and after an hour of stillness, a strange feeling settled over me. Not dread exactly, but the sharp, fragile calm that comes just before you realize how exposed you truly are. The infantry was late, or lost, or worse, and Feldman didn't say it, but I could see in his face that he was already calculating fallback points, escape routes, and worst-case scenarios. Around dusk, we heard distant gunfire, not heavy, not sustained, just short bursts, scattered, like someone trying to send a message. Otto picked up a garbled radio transmission a few minutes later, something about contact near the river bend, and that was enough for Feldman to order a slow advance toward the station, where we might get better visibility. As we moved, the streets narrowed, and the sound of our tracks echoed off the shattered buildings, the tank's shadow growing longer in the fading light, and I couldn't shake the feeling that every window was watching us, every pile of rubble hiding not bodies, but intentions. We stopped just short of the central square, the Tiger positioned behind a burned-out bus, and set up a temporary hold. Klaus cut the engine, and in the sudden quiet that followed, I could hear the wind pushing broken shutters against the walls, the dry rustle of paper blowing across the cobblestones, and something else. Distant footsteps, soft, irregular, fading quickly. We didn't investigate. We didn't want to. That night, no one slept. We took turns on watch, but even those resting didn't truly rest, just sat with their backs to steel and their minds circling the same thoughts. Heinrich took out the photo again, the one with the woman and the boy, and stared at it until the paper shook in his hand. Otto kept scribbling, not words anymore, just lines, circles, maps of nowhere. And me, I lay there listening to the creak of the turret ring cooling, wondering if the town remembered the people who once lived in it, or if all memory had been erased by flame, blast, and time. In the dark, the Tiger didn't feel like armor. It felt like a tomb, with the door still open. The morning after that sleepless night arrived not with sunlight or clarity, but with a fog so thick it wrapped the entire town in a wet, grey silence, muffling every sound and turning every shape into something unfamiliar. And as we sat inside the Tiger with the engine off and the optics fogged from condensation, it felt as though the world had folded in around us, erasing the lines between enemy and ally, between buildings and sky, between movement and stillness. Feldman issued no orders at first. We remained parked in the same position, behind the skeletal bus and beneath a sagging power line, and the only sounds inside were the occasional click of Otto's tuning dial, the soft clink of Heinrich adjusting a shell in the rack, and the faint rhythmic tapping of Klaus's boot against the hull floor. I watched the fog through the scope, wiping it clean every few minutes, but each time I looked, the view was the same. Gray, shifting nothing, like staring into a dream where time had no edge. Sometime before noon, Otto finally caught a signal, short and broken, but clear enough to make out two words. "Don't move." He repeated them twice, louder the second time, and for a moment no one spoke. Then Feldman ordered us to remain cold, all systems off, no turret rotation, hatches sealed, and that was when we knew something was out there, close. The fog became a presence of its own, a living thing that pressed against the Tiger's steel skin like fingers from the outside, and each of us began to imagine what might be hiding just beyond our vision. Infantry, satchel charges, armor, or worse, nothing at all. The weight of not knowing was a kind of terror I hadn't expected, worse in some ways than battle, because it made your mind the enemy, made your thoughts loop in circles of doubt and memory, until even the creak of your own boots sounded like danger. Hours passed, maybe 3, maybe more. We sat in place, barely moving, barely breathing, listening. Once we heard what sounded like footsteps on rubble, slow and uneven, moving just beyond the edge of the square, and I held my breath as I moved my hand toward the firing lever, not out of fear, but out of a strange resigned calm, as if the silence ending would be a relief. But nothing came. No shot, no voice, just the sound fading into mist again. At some point, Feldman whispered that he thought he saw a figure through the command scope, unmoving, partially hidden behind a pile of bricks. We all took turns watching, but the fog played tricks on us. Sometimes the figure was there, sometimes it wasn't. Was it a man, a statue, a shape of smoke? We never found out. Night fell before the fog lifted. When it finally began to thin, the buildings returned slowly, the outlines sharpening like memories returning after a long absence, and by then, we were too tired to speak. Feldman gave the order to pull back to the warehouse ruins, and we did so without question, the Tiger's engine growling softly as we reversed across the square. When we shut down again and unlatched the top hatch, the sky above was black and filled with stars. Too many stars. Sharp and cold like glass scattered across velvet, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the distance between us and everything else, not in kilometers, but in years, in lives. That night I dreamed not of war, but of silence, and in the dream, I was not afraid of it, but surrounded by it like an ocean, floating. I think we all dreamed something like that, because in the morning, we looked at each other with the kind of eyes that have seen ghosts, not ones outside the tank, but the ones we carry with us, always, even when the fog lifts. The junction town was behind us now, reduced in the rearview mirror of memory to a blur of cracked stone, burnt doors, and the sound of footsteps that never became voices. And as we rolled out toward the northern tree line, following a gravel road that had once been a lifeline for freight and now served only as a path for machines like ours, the mood inside the Tiger shifted. Not lighter, not exactly, but quieter in a different way, like the kind of silence that follows a decision already made. Feldman didn't speak much. He rode higher than usual in the hatch, his coat flapping slightly in the wind, one glove off so he could feel the map between his fingers. And I watched him occasionally adjust the folds like he was tracing not terrain, but time. The order was simple. Link up with a small armored unit regrouping near the forest's edge, provide cover, and await further instruction. It sounded straightforward. We had learned by now that nothing ever was. The forest ahead wasn't like the thin birch groves we'd seen before. It was thicker, darker, filled with pines that pressed close together like a wall, their branches heavy with old snow and silence. As we entered the first stretch, the light shifted, dimming beneath the canopy, and the Tiger's engine, usually loud and constant, seemed to mute itself slightly, as if the forest had swallowed it. Klaus slowed us to a crawl, not from fear but from necessity, because the ground beneath the trees was uneven and littered with half-frozen roots and the scattered bones of smaller vehicles, motorcycles, carts, even a truck cab with its wheels gone and its interior stripped down to rust. Otto noted something on the map, an alternate trail curving to the east, but Feldman shook his head and pointed forward. We stayed on course. Half an hour in, we stopped to rest the engine and assess the road. The air smelled of pine, oil, and something older. Wet bark, maybe, or smoke long since faded. Heinrich took the opportunity to check the main gun's elevation system, muttering to himself as he spun the handwheel and watched the barrel adjust with that slow, stubborn grace only the Tiger had. Otto leaned back against the wall and closed his eyes, and for once, didn't write or listen to the radio. He just sat still. I climbed out to the turret roof and looked up through the trees. The sky was barely visible, just thin veins of gray threading between the branches, and for a moment, I imagined we were the only living things left in this part of the world. 5 men in a metal beast, crawling through a forgotten forest in search of something that might not even be there anymore. When we started moving again, the sun was already beginning to fall behind the trees, and the long shadows made the trunks look like soldiers standing at attention, watching us pass. A fox darted across the trail ahead, lean and orange and silent, and we all saw it but said nothing. There were no birds. As darkness settled fully and the road disappeared entirely beneath the snow-patched underbrush, Feldman called a halt and ordered full blackout. No engine, no lights, no movement. We parked beside a fallen pine, and wrapped ourselves in whatever warmth we had, not from cold, but from the understanding that this place, this stretch of forest, did not belong to us, and we were only guests here, unwelcome and temporary. That night, I dreamed of trees, endless trees, reaching down instead of up, their roots curling like hands around the Tiger, pulling us slowly, gently, into the earth. When I woke, Heinrich was staring at me. He didn't ask what I'd seen, he just said, "They don't want us here," and closed the hatch, without another word. We reached the clearing just after midday, the Tiger's tracks grinding up a soft slope that opened into a wide, bowl-shaped depression, surrounded by tall firs and ridgelines that felt too high and too close. And before Feldman even gave the signal, we knew it wasn't right. There was no wind in that place, no birdsong, not even the creak of trees shifting in the breeze, only the low hum of the engine and the sound of our breath inside the hull. The rendezvous point was supposed to be here, Grid 1, 9E2, just as the map said. But there were no vehicles waiting, no signs of recent passage. only a cluster of broken crates half buried in snow, and a collapsed tent frame tilted on its side like a skeletal ribcage. Otto called out over the radio again, repeating the last frequency, but received only static in return. Klaus cut the engine at Feldman's command, and the quiet that followed was immediate and thick, the kind of quiet that didn't feel like absence but pressure, as if something unseen was leaning in around us. We waited. 1 hour. Then 2. I remained at the scope, sweeping the ridgeline, but everything was still, too still. Heinrich handed me a canteen without speaking, and I drank without tasting. Feldman stood outside the turret now, his back to us, scanning the woods through binoculars, one hand gripping the edge of the hatch like it might keep him grounded. At some point, Klaus said what we were all thinking: "They're not coming." Feldman didn't respond. Instead, he slid back inside and quietly unfolded the map again, marking something in the corner with the edge of a broken pencil. Then he said, "We'll wait until nightfall. If nothing comes, we head east." That was the plan. But night came faster than expected. The sun vanished behind the ridgeline, like it had somewhere better to be, and soon, the shadows consumed everything but the sky. And the sky itself was a flat iron sheet without stars. We shut the hatches, turned off all systems, and took turns watching through the periscopes. That's when we started hearing things. Not voices, not words, but sounds. Something moving in the snow beyond the trees. Something dragging slowly across ice, rhythmic and patient, like boots, or maybe claws, crunching just beyond the range of the scope. At first we thought it might be wildlife, but it circled. It passed on one side of the clearing, then the other, always just far enough to avoid being seen, always just close enough to be heard. I kept my hand on the elevation wheel, my finger near the trigger, but I didn't fire, because there was nothing to aim at, only the sound of movement, and the low rumble in my chest that felt like fear being slowly wound into a tighter coil. Otto whispered, "It's not them," and no one disagreed. Hours passed. The noise stopped, then started again. Feldman never left the commander's seat. Heinrich closed his eyes but didn't sleep. Klaus sat with both hands on the brake lever like he might pull it at any second. And me. I stared through the scope until my eyes burned, hoping to see something and terrified that I might. Just before dawn, everything stopped. No wind, no movement. Just light, slowly rising, pale and colorless. When we finally opened the hatch, the air was so cold it made our teeth ache. There were no tracks in the snow around the tiger, nothing disturbed, no sign of anyone, or anything, ever having been there. We restarted the engine in silence and rolled back onto the trail, none of us speaking until well past noon. And even then, no one asked what we'd heard. We didn't need to. We already knew. The road east took us away from the forest, and into a flatter, more open landscape, where the trees gave way to fields of scorched earth and brittle grass. The kind of terrain that looked peaceful only until you noticed the scorched outlines of trenches, the shallow craters half filled with rainwater, the broken steel torn and twisted like bones. We moved slowly, the Tiger's engine humming low. Every bump in the road felt through the suspension like a quiet reminder that even here, far from the sounds of battle, the land remembered. The map was clearer now. Fewer obstacles, fewer crossings. But Feldman marked every ruined structure we passed, every side road, every burned village, as if tracing a kind of private history across the page. I asked once if he planned to submit it with his report, but he just shook his head and said, "It's not for them." We didn't question that. Somewhere past midday, we came across a field, dotted with dozens of white sheets, half buried in snow, fluttering faintly in the wind, like abandoned flags. As we got closer, we saw what they were: makeshift markers, cloth tied to sticks, each marking a shallow grave. No names, no dates, just markers. The Tiger slowed to a crawl, and none of us spoke as we passed. Otto looked away. Klaus tightened his grip on the throttle. Heinrich took off his helmet, and held it in his lap. I kept my eyes forward, but I counted 37 that I could see. Maybe more. No sign of a battle, just the graves. That night we stopped by a dried-out riverbed, where the banks were cracked, and the mud frozen into hard, uneven ridges. The sky was clearer than it had been in weeks, and for a while we stood outside the tank and stared at the stars, each man silent, each lost in thought. It was Heinrich who finally said what we were all thinking. What if this is all we ever are now? This tank, these roads, just rolling forward until something stops us. Otto answered without looking up. It already has. I don't know what he meant exactly, but I felt it too. Like something inside had stopped moving long ago, and everything since had been momentum, not choice. Feldman lit a cigarette, the glow of it small and weak in the dark, and said, "We're ghosts with heartbeat, they just forgot to bury us." No one laughed. No one argued. We sat in a broken circle beside the tiger, until the cold drove us back inside. That night I dreamed of a road that went on forever, flat, empty, with no turns, no towns, no markers, and the tiger just kept rolling, our faces older, our hands gray, but the engine never stopped, and the sky above was black and starless, and nothing ever came. I woke with a chill I couldn't shake. In the morning, we found a half-frozen dog beside the riverbank, still breathing. Klaus wrapped it in his coat without asking, and we let it ride with us the rest of the day, curled at his feet, too weak to move. We didn't speak about it, but I think we all needed something alive with us, something small and fragile, that reminded us we hadn't become entirely machine. As we moved on, I watched the sunrise through the scope, light breaking over the frost, the fields glowing faintly gold, and for a few minutes, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, something waited for us on the other side of this road, that wasn't just more war, more silence, more dirt. Just something. The road began to vanish beneath us the closer we got to the last checkpoint. A rough line drawn across the map in blue pencil, marking a location we had been told to reach, but not told why. And as the sun set behind a curtain of haze, the dirt path we followed turned to uneven frost-cracked ground, littered with debris from old columns, splintered crates, torn canvas, rusted canteens, the occasional wheel rim half buried in dry mud. No fresh tracks, no signs of recent movement, just the sense that we were rolling forward into something that had already happened, something finished and waiting. Feldman didn't look up from the map anymore. He sat low in the command seat, head bent, tracing the same fold with one gloved thumb again and again. When Otto asked quietly, "What if we're the only ones left heading there?" no one answered. The question wasn't fear, it was calculation. That evening, we found what remained of the checkpoint. A single radio truck, burned from the inside, its frame still black and warped, the smell of old fire clinging to the air even though the wind had done its best to carry it away. Around it, the signs of a brief, violent engagement. Drag marks in the earth, expended cartridges, a broken rifle twisted in the shape of a question mark. No bodies. Just the aftermath. We parked the Tiger 100 meters out, behind a low ridge, and Feldman sent Otto and Klaus to scout on foot, while the rest of us remained inside. It was the longest half hour of my life. Every second without a report, every flicker in the trees, every sound outside that didn't match our own breathing made me grip the elevation wheel a little tighter, imagining what I would do if I saw muzzle flashes, if the ridge exploded with fire. But it didn't. They returned. No contact. Just silence. Just that one ghost of a vehicle. That night we didn't camp. We simply shut the hatches, powered down, and waited. I don't know if anyone else slept. I didn't. I lay on the turret floor, staring at the rivets in the ceiling, counting them over and over like they might keep me grounded. And all I could think was that the war was swallowing itself. That we weren't heading toward an end, but being drawn into the eye of something that had no center. In the morning, Feldman said, "We go one more day, then we turn around." And we nodded, because none of us wanted to say it. but we all knew there was nothing left to turn back to. Around noon, we reached a long bridge over a frozen river. The bridge was damaged. One side buckled slightly, the railings gone. We stopped. We stared. And then, without speaking, we crossed. Slow. Steady. The ice below groaned faintly. The tiger creaked with each rotation of its heavy tracks. No one breathed until we touched the other side. When we did, it was as if something let go of our chests, but what we found beyond the bridge was not a base. Not reinforcements. Not a rally point. Just snow-covered fields, low hills, a single barn collapsed in on itself, and the shape of a convoy burned into the landscape. Ruts, ash, tracks that ended in black craters. Feldman dismounted and stood there for a long time. Then he said something I'll never forget. "This isn't the end of the road. This is the place where roads forget they ever began." That night, I sat on the edge of the turret, looking at the stars. The dog, now stronger, lay beside Klaus in the hull, breathing softly. Heinrich leaned against the hull, smoking in silence. Otto drew a spiral in the dirt with the tip of his boot. We didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. Just one more night, inside the tiger. One more quiet breath in the steel lung that had become our world. The final morning came without warning, without signal, without any grand shift in weather or sudden sense of closure. Just another sky, the color of old paper. Another breath turned to mist inside the hull. Another stretch of frozen earth unfolding ahead of us like a ribbon with no writing left on it. We rolled forward at first light, the tiger's tracks humming softly beneath us. The weight of everything we had seen and everything we hadn't, settling deep in our bodies like dust. And though no one spoke of it, I think we all knew this was the last leg. Not because we'd been told so, but because it felt like even the machine was ready to stop. The engine had begun to make a low knock every 7th turn, faint and irregular, but persistent. And Klaus didn't bother to hide the way his hands lingered near the kill switch, as if listening for the moment it would become something worse. Feldman didn't study the map anymore. He just sat with it folded in his lap, unread, his eyes watching the road through the command slit like a man watching the last pages of a book he's already memorized. Otto hadn't touched the radio in hours. Heinrich had stopped counting shells. I had stopped scanning for targets. All we were doing now was moving forward, not out of purpose, but momentum, like a thrown stone that had forgotten it was once in someone's hand. Just before midday, we reached a rise overlooking what had once been a village. A few low foundations, a cracked church steeple leaning like a finger pointing at nothing, and a field of churned mud scarred with tank tracks old and faded. There were no bodies, no signs of battle, just absence, the kind of absence that lives in the bones of places long after the people are gone. We parked there, at the crest of that nameless hill, engine idling for a minute before Klaus finally shut it off. And the sudden silence that followed was the deepest we had ever known. No wind, no birds, no orders, not even the ticking of cooling metal, just the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring with the memory of sound. Feldman climbed out first, stepping down onto the earth with a kind of finality, like a man walking into a room he once called home but no longer recognizes. The rest of us followed, one by one, until we stood beside the tiger in a loose circle, faces pale in the light, breath visible. Otto walked to the edge of the hill and sat down, notebook open in his lap. Heinrich lit a cigarette with shaking fingers. Klaus knelt beside the dog, now alert, and watching the horizon. I climbed onto the turret, sat with my legs dangling, and looked out over that ruined field. And for the first time in months, I didn't feel like a soldier. I didn't feel like a ghost, or a survivor, or even a man inside a tank. I felt like someone at the end of something, too tired to turn the page but too human to let it close without knowing how it ends. Feldman said nothing for a long time. Then finally he looked at us. His crew, his men, the last fragments of a machine that had once meant something, and he said, "No more roads." We left the tiger where she stood, engine off, hatches closed, like a monument to a chapter no one would read. We walked east, across the broken field, not looking back, not counting steps, not speaking. And as we moved, I realized that what we were leaving behind was more than steel and smoke. We were leaving behind the part of ourselves that had once believed there would be something waiting at the end, an answer, a purpose, a reason. But there was only this, a road traveled, a war survived, and the quiet, steady truth that sometimes the only way to keep going is to know when to stop. And we had stopped.